Welcome to the Surviving to Thriving podcast with Jim Squire. I'm a registered psychotherapist here in Toronto, Canada, and this is actually my 12th episode. The title of this episode is Understanding the Ego. Now, the ego is an area that for a lot of people we've heard about it, but we really don't quite know what it is or that much about it. So hopefully through this episode, we can dive a bit into what the ego is, why it's important to understand it better, how does it interact with our day-to-day functioning, and what are some of the problematic situations that could come up with the ego. So there's different ways to describe the ego. Some people will look at the ego from the perspective that Freud, roughly I guess about 100 years ago, viewed the ego. He actually had three sort of components to the ego: the id, which is sort of our base kind of impulses, cravings, urges, those types of things. The ego was one term, which was sort of it's how we interact with reality, and then superego was kind of the area that governs our morality. So, for example, the id wants to do something impulsive. The superego would come in and say, that's not going to be socially acceptable, don't do that. So that's just kind of a nutshell. I don't follow, I'm not going to dwell too much on that. If some people had heard the term superego, id, that sort of thing, I want to make sure I at least covered that. But looking at the ego, and typically in the way I teach it in my course and the way I share with my clients, is I'm looking at it from what we call the constructivist perspective, which is the ego is constructed. It's part of our identity. Maybe the technical way is the ego is the part of self that creates mental representations of the world. Another way to look at it is a term we use is the self as a story. So it's the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves creates the ego. And it's something that, of course, through our lifespan will evolve and develop as we do. But it's interesting that it's such an important part of how we function, and most people have very little understanding of it. Now, we do often, in jest, let's say, refer to someone who's maybe an egomaniac or someone who's got a big ego, that sort of thing. But do we really understand sometimes, and this is where I like to spend a lot of the work I do, is helping people see, do I know when I'm kind of like living through my ego, or when my ego is very active in a particular area? Because it's very important. The ego has very specific needs and very specific function and focus, which may not line up with our values. One of the stories I often tell people is a few months ago I was at the car dealership and I took my daughter, and as we were waiting for the car to be worked on, she sort of wandered around and saw a brand new SUV that was a bright colored blue. What she didn't realize was this was a Cadillac SUV, which was worth about, I think, $85,000. So, and when she walked up to him, she was looking at it, and that was a moment when I just kind of envisioned myself driving it, envisioned myself driving home, pulling in the driveway, that sort of thing. And that was a good example of my ego was very active at that moment. I was looking at myself in that vehicle, looking at how people would see me. And funny enough, when I saw what the payments were, it quickly took me out of my ego and back into reality, which was, paying $1,000 a month for a car payment, which is not something I would personally do. So, I spent a lot of time being very aware of my ego, so it's something that I kind of was almost laughing about in terms of how I just kind of slipped into this a very appealing sort of scenario. But let's just go into more detail about what we're looking at in terms of the ego. So as I said earlier, it's an embodiment of the sort of stories we tell ourselves. What I mean by that is, I'll use myself as an example. I'm, a certain age. People typically like me. I'm a psychotherapist. I have this kind of income. I have maybe this kind of status in the community. These are all things that are part of the stories I tell myself. I'm good at this, I'm not good at that. Very descriptive sometimes about our life, but also, I think to me, it has also a lot to do with our social, sometimes I use the term social hierarchy. So as I mentioned to you, like our status, how do I relate to others in a similar situation? I think that's really where I find the ego is very active. A lot of times people are comparing themselves to others, and their ego is very, very much loves to compare to others, and it's very motivated to have you appear in a better position than others, which is something that, it's important to be aware of. You and your value system may not care how your neighbor perceives you in general, but your ego does. Your ego wants people to perceive you in a very positive way. Now, I think that one of the reasons we have an ego is it's part of our survival system to ensure, as social creatures, that we have make great sort of efforts to ensure we have a good reputation, we have a good status within the community, because that, in a sense, would ensure survivals. Now, that's just a very basic way of approaching it, but I do feel strongly that if you look at how the ego gets very active, if I'm going to lose my job, it's not just that I'm going to lose my money, the income, from the job. It's also that there's a lot of status attached to the certain position, in a sense. So that could be quite painful for an individual. For example, I could be financially stable and I don't need the job, but losing the job could hurt from an ego perspective. Now, I'm not saying there isn't other things about that, like loss of connections to people that you care about, that sort of thing, or even work that you enjoy. I'm not saying that's not important or that doesn't happen. But if you look closely at that, you'd kind of see that the ego would be quite triggered, in a sense, by not so much the loss of the job necessarily that extreme, but even the threat of the loss of the job is where we find the ego very active. So So there are terms that are thrown around sometimes, like egomaniac, as I said earlier, egocentric, someone who's very focused on their ego. Now, we often use this term with children who are sort of, probably about the age of like 5 or 6 through to preteens, where they would be developing and they can't help it. We're all kind of in that developmental stage, very egocentric. We're very much focused on our own needs. We haven't really developed empathy yet, so we're not thinking so much about how our actions, behaviors affect others. We're very just focused, as a 7 or 8-year-old child would be, on the world through the lens of ourself. And that's why it's sometimes hard with children when you're wanting them to share or get along with others, or even help them understand that something they're doing is hurting another child, that for them to grasp that as being meaningful, because they're so focused on just what matters and what's relevant to them. So typically, as we develop empathy into our teens and into being an adult, we would become less focused on this, or less egocentric in a sense. So sometimes then someone who's very much focused on their ego and acting from their ego would be perceived by other adults as a bit immature. Most people have enough awareness to realize when they're sort of behaving that way. One of the people that I respect a lot that does write a lot about the ego, that if you're interested in learning quite a bit about the ego, I recommend, is Eckhart Tolle, who wrote The Power of Now. Now, I understand years ago I read that book and I don't think I really understood much of it. But he talks quite a bit about the ego. He talks quite a bit about how the ego's desire to maintain a certain status quo or a certain sort of image or identity triggers a lot of anxiety and fear over maintaining that. And I think that's very true, that if I have a certain job and a certain status in the community and I have, a lot of possessions and things that are meaningful to me, especially to the ego, the fear and anxiety around potentially losing those is very real. It's very much coming from the ego. Sometimes you could even be aware personally of experiences you might have had where something really hurt you, and then when you look closely at it, there wasn't a lot of money involved, but it hurt your feelings in some way, or it was really difficult for you. Sometimes, investing in the stock market, thinking the stock can go up and then it goes down. You might lose a couple $1,000s and you're able to absorb that. But the ego might not, I look foolish, or I don't look competent, or I messed this up. And maybe I've gone around and told everybody I've got this amazing stock, it's going to do really well. And then it didn't do well. So that would be something that would certainly trigger the ego. And also one thing that Eckhart Tolle talks a lot about is the ego is identifying so much with thoughts and emotional elements that it really creates a lot of challenges when you're trying to create some sort of stillness in your life, meditation practice, being more mindful, that sort of thing. The ego really doesn't understand the importance of something like that. Now, one of the ways that he suggests is to get out of the ego is to try to stay in the present moment. And certainly, I would agree that if I'm focused on, say, my breathing and being present in the present moment, then I'm not in my ego.
So, what is very much key to overcoming
future? This, and not so much sort of emphasis on the ego moment. This being driven by the ego, being caught up in the ego, however we describe it. It's very simple, really, in terms of a general an answer to that. In terms of like being able to do it, isn't that necessarily that easy. Self-awareness is the key. Because if you're aware of what's happening, and if you're aware of your ego being activated or triggered, then you're not in your ego. It's when you're not aware of it that your ego could be driving your life, driving your efforts, focusing, generating a lot of fear and anxiety over things that may or may not happen. So one of the things we do in my course is we have the observation meditation where people, through the meditation, will be observing their thoughts and observing the ego and how it's operating and stuff. Typically, I think a lot of the times when people are starting to meditate, the ego is very active because they don't know necessarily what they're doing. And when they feel they're not doing it correctly, they'll get frustrated with themselves and say, I can't do this. And so that would be certainly something that's being driven by the ego. Like it's wanting to be successful and good at something. And when you're not, it's frustrated. It's triggering some frustration. Instead of, the other side of it, which we tell people it's a process. My mind drifts off all the time when I'm meditating, and I bring it back gently, and that's okay. And anyone that probably has meditated even for many years would say the same thing. But it's this idea that we have to do it right and do it perfectly and do it well would be something that's very much driven by the ego. And so especially in mindfulness is something we want to get away from. We want to be able to realize when the ego, which is almost like the opposite of what we're trying to achieve with mindfulness, which is to be present, to be observing, and to not be judgmental, and to be accepting. And the ego is certainly the opposite of those. So the ego also would drive a lot of, as I said earlier, comparison. It has a lot to do with control, certainly fear and anxiety. The mechanism that they trigger is control. And so people that are often anxious, fearful, trying to over control, in many cases they'll be concerned about something going wrong that will affect their identity, who they are. I lose my job, I lose some money, might lose my partner. And while I may love my partner, I may also love the idea of having a partner, which is very appealing to the ego. Certainly things like jealousy and the classic one, defensive behavior. In most cases, the defensive behavior is driven by the ego. For example, let's say I was interacting with a client and the client told me that they, you're not a very good therapist. I don't find that you were helpful at all. Now, typically myself, I would be, understand that I'm not going to be the right fit for everyone. But if I was in my ego and the person said you're not a very good therapist, my first reaction might be to get angry, to want to explain my credentials or my experience or things about me, to sort of counter what they're saying. So often when you find yourself jumping to respond very defensively and in a very reactive way, it can often be that the stories you have told yourself about who you are is now being challenged by someone else. We see this a lot in relationships, where I might think that I'm a kind, loving, supportive partner, and then my partner is telling me you're not supportive. You're not there for me. You're not, maybe she's saying I'm selfish. I don't know. But those things can certainly trigger your ego because you're, in a sense, saying deep down your feelings like, that's not true. I don't agree with that. The problem is if this is coming from the ego, it's in a sense a construct. So this is what I'm constructing. So there isn't 100% confidence in this. And so if someone is to come along and say you're just not very good at this, or you think you're a lot better at this than you actually are, those are classic, very simple scenarios where our ego is very much often activated. Now, for someone like myself who focuses on this a lot, I will notice, I will observe when my ego gets activated. I won't necessarily say anything, but I will notice a desire to respond in some way, and I'm usually able to step back from it, take a pause, take a moment, and respond in a way that I think is appropriate. Now, certainly anyone's entitled to have an opinion about me. I may not like it, but I understand that everyone can have an opinion, and also understand the fact that I'm not going to appeal as a person to everyone. Although my ego wouldn't necessarily be as understanding of that. What is the other way that we can become more aware of the ego? Is to just become more aware of thoughts, feelings, behaviors that are as they're reflecting around specific events. And it's pretty easy. You'll start to notice where the ego is activated, where it's not. Usually there's a kind of a, as I said earlier, a kind of a defensive, strong desire to react. One of the things we want people to understand about the ego is you are much more than your thoughts and your emotions and your ego. There is a part of you, as we would describe. There again, this is a perspective that I believe is relevant, but not everybody would agree with this. Is that we're taking on the position of the observer of ourself. We can start to notice these patterns, and so for me, the actual person, who I really am, is the one that's doing the observing. And think about that for a minute. if I'm observing my thoughts and my emotions and my ego being activated, I'm watching and observing. So of course there has to be another part of me, and that we typically understand to be that's our true self. And now I don't want to get too complicated into that, but anyone can sort of sit down and spend some time observing their thoughts and observing, the patterns of thoughts and emotions without judging, just kind of observing. It's one of the basic first steps we have in any kind of mindfulness training is just getting more comfortable with that. So basically, to kind of sum this all up, understanding the ego from a constructivist perspective is a powerful tool for personal growth and healing. It helps us develop a more integrated sense of self and cultivate a greater sense of personal freedom. By becoming more aware of our ego's function and working with it, we can move beyond limiting beliefs and behaviors and create a more fulfilling life. Applying the constructivist perspective to our everyday lives means we're recognizing the power to shape our experiences and make conscious choices that align with our values and goals. The journey towards self-discovery and personal growth is not always easy, but it is incredibly rewarding. And although none of us typically are going to live without an ego, it's very good to be aware of where your ego gets triggered, the areas that you struggle, as much as it is with any other area where you're finding yourself, not being as operating at your best in a sense. So I invite you to spend some time reflecting on your ego, thinking about it, as I said, from the perspective of, it's a collection of stories you tell yourself about who you are, basically part of your identity. It's a mental representation of self, or another way of phrasing it. And in a lot of cases, that is not accurate. In a lot of cases, it is something that is very flawed in terms of being accurate, truthful. And sometimes it doesn't line up a lot with my values. So my ego will focus a lot on, say, the career I do, but maybe the main thing that drives me in life is my family and my family connections. Now, certainly if those got threatened on some way, my ego would get very activated. But your ego isn't necessarily going to, it's not going to embody the values you have. You have to be, I think a lot of the times it's looking at that from a much more sort of social construct of like, how are others perceiving me? How are others viewing me? That sort of thing, which when you get down to your basic values may not be something that's that important to you. So it's good to be aware, and the easiest way to become aware of all of this, increase your self-awareness, is to just simply observe your thoughts and emotions, and in this case your ego, as frequently as you can.